The Scottish Highlands had never seemed so ominous. You could see it in King Charles III's face as he lowered the crimson-bordered document onto the antique desk at Balmoral Castle, his expression transforming from placid concentration to something far more troubled. The September rain lashed against the windows, creating a fitting soundtrack for the moment when the monarch first learned of what palace insiders would later call the rebellion. "Your Majesty," his private secretary had said just moments earlier, "I believe this requires your immediate attention." The carefully neutral tone couldn't disguise the urgency. As Charles read, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After 7 decades of waiting, his first year wearing the crown was proving more treacherous than anyone had predicted. Just beyond the study door, an unprecedented gathering was taking place. Senior royal aides huddled in urgent conversation, deliberately convened while the king was occupied. What Charles didn't yet know was that the document in his hands represented only the visible portion of a palace iceberg that threatened to sink the early years of his reign. The whispers had been building for months, the resistance to his vision, the quiet questioning of his judgment, the discreet phone calls between factions. You could see it in his eyes as he gazed out across the rain-soaked Scottish estate where his mother had drawn her last breath just a year earlier. The weight of her legacy pressed down alongside the gathering storm. What would you do if your first year as monarch was about to be derailed by those closest to you? How would you respond when discovering that the greatest threat to your reign came not from Republicans or political opponents, but from within the ancient walls you called home? The path to this moment began on September 8, 2022, when Buckingham Palace issued the solemn statement that Queen Elizabeth II had died peacefully at Balmoral. Within hours, Charles had become king, a role for which he had the longest apprenticeship in British history, yet one that arrived with expectations nearly impossible to fulfill. "The Queen is dead, long live the King," proclaimed the headlines. But behind the ceremonial facade, Charles faced an institution in flux. The monarchy he inherited was simultaneously beloved and questioned, traditional and in need of modernization, wealthy yet under financial scrutiny. The Queen's 7-decade reign had provided stability through her careful, conservative approach to change, evolution at a glacial pace. Charles, however, arrived with more urgent plans. "I shall endeavor to serve you with loyalty, respect, and love," he promised in his first address as monarch. What went unspoken was his determination to reshape the institution, a vision he had developed over decades. The first signs of internal resistance emerged during the transition. While the public witnessed a seamless handover of power within palace walls, Charles was already encountering the entrenched bureaucracy that had served his mother loyally but viewed her son with caution. The royal household, a complex organization employing hundreds, contained power centers and fiefdoms developed over decades. "Your Majesty might consider waiting until after the coronation for major changes," suggested one senior courtier, a veiled recommendation to delay the slimmed-down monarchy Charles had long advocated. That evening, in the private apartments at Clarence House, Charles confided to Camilla, "They speak as if I'm a caretaker rather than their king." The Queen Consort placed her hand on his, understanding the frustration of a man who had waited a lifetime to implement his vision. The royal household had weathered centuries of monarchs, each with their own temperament and ambitions. Palace coups were nothing new, from the power struggles during George III's illness to the careful management of Edward VII's impulses. What made Charles's situation unique was the modern context, a monarchy under unprecedented public scrutiny, with every decision dissected by a relentless media landscape. Within the royal apparatus, power resided not just with those holding grand titles, but with the gatekeepers, the private secretaries who controlled access to the monarch, the communications directors who shaped public narrative, the keepers of the privy purse who oversaw finances. Many had served the Queen for decades, their loyalty to her unquestioned, but their allegiance to her son less certain. Sir Edward Holbrook, the Queen's former assistant private secretary, once observed that the royal household is not merely staff, it's the living embodiment of institutional memory. That memory, however, could become resistance when faced with a monarch eager for change. Charles's management style diverged sharply from his mother's. Where the Queen had been content to be briefed and advised, Charles questioned, challenged, and immersed himself in details. His decades running the Duchy of Cornwall and his charitable foundations had made him accustomed to hands-on leadership. Now, as sovereign, he expected the same level of engagement, a stark departure from the previous reign. The king wishes to see the communication strategy before it's implemented, became a request that caused discomfort among those accustomed to greater autonomy. In meetings, staff observed how different factions were emerging. When Charles left rooms, whispered conversations would begin. He doesn't understand how things work here, some would say, while others argued, it's time things changed. Meanwhile, Lady Anne Weatherby, who had served the royal family for 3 decades, noticed something troubling after a budget meeting. As she returned to collect her forgotten scarf, she glimpsed the assistant private secretary hastily sliding documents into a folder when the king was mentioned as approaching. The fleeting expression, something between guilt and resolve, would later prove to be the first visible crack in what would become a widening chasm within the king's household. The first public indication of trouble came just days after the Queen's death, when newspapers reported that dozens of Clarence House staff had received redundancy notices while working through the mourning period. While busy making changes for one family, they're busy breaking up another, one anonymous staff member told The Guardian. The timing created an immediate public relations challenge. While legally proper, staff had been employed by Charles as Prince of Wales, not as king. The handling struck many as cold. Inside the palace, affected employees shared their grievances, not just with each other, but with sympathetic journalists. One long-serving member of a household staff was overheard in a Westminster pub. 30 years of service, and not even a proper conversation, just a letter. Behind closed doors, senior courtiers expressed concern about the pace of change. Your Majesty might consider a more gradual approach, suggested one veteran palace official, with the carefully modulated language that disguised an unmistakable warning. That evening, the first anonymous quote appeared in the Evening Standard. There's a sense of chaotic management at the highest levels. The king is moving too quickly and without proper consultation. The source was identified only as a senior royal insider, but the damage was done. Charles's environmental passions, long established during his years as Prince of Wales, created another flashpoint. His request to use sustainable aviation fuel for all royal flights and transition the royal fleet to electric vehicles was met with resistance cloaked as pragmatism. "Ma'am, could you speak with him?" One courtier implicitly asked Queen Camilla during a private moment at Windsor Castle. These climate initiatives are all well and good, but there are concerns he's overstepping constitutional boundaries. The government needs to lead on policy matters. The real tension emerged during a Privy Council meeting, where Charles raised the possibility of opening more royal properties to the public and converting some to sustainable energy showcases. Several councillors shifted uncomfortably, particularly when he suggested Buckingham Palace might operate with fewer staff and a smaller environmental footprint. The monarchy must demonstrate leadership on these issues, Charles insisted. What he didn't know was that a detailed financial analysis of his proposals, one that supported their feasibility, had never reached him. The document had been intentionally buried by those who considered the king's environmental enthusiasm a threat to the institution's traditionalist image. When Charles later discovered the withheld report, His quiet fury was palpable. "Who," he asked with dangerous calm, "decided I shouldn't see this?" Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, Prince William was carving out his own approach as heir to the throne. His streamlined operation contrasted with the larger Buckingham Palace machine, creating inevitable comparisons. Media narratives began positioning father and son as representing different visions. Charles as the transitional king clinging to passion projects versus William as the future-focused modern monarch in waiting. In reality, their views aligned more than they diverged, but perceptions were being carefully shaped. Staff loyalty became increasingly divided, with some aides informally reporting to both households, but privately expressing preferences. "The Prince of Wales understands what the modern monarchy needs to be," one aide whispered to another after a joint engagement. Neither noticed the king's equerry overhearing their conversation. The most revealing moment came when Charles discovered emails between his communications team and William's staff discussing how to position certain royal initiatives, discussions from which the king had been deliberately excluded. Charles's reaction was not immediate anger, but something more calculated. He began keeping notes. Health concerns became another lever used against him. At 74, Charles was the oldest monarch to ever ascend the British throne. Though robust and maintaining a punishing schedule, whispers about his stamina circulated within palace corridors. While reviewing his calendar in the map room at Buckingham Palace, Charles overheard two senior staff members in the adjacent room. "We should have contingency plans if his health doesn't hold up," one said. "The Wales office should be prepared to step in more frequently." There had been no consultation with the king about such contingencies. As Charles planned his first Commonwealth tour, a diplomatic priority, internal debate erupted over its scope. The Foreign Office recommended a streamlined visit to just 3 nations. Charles, however, insisted on a broader itinerary, reflecting his personal commitment to the Commonwealth. "The king is being advised that his proposed schedule may be too ambitious," noted an internal memo that was subsequently leaked to the Times. That evening, Charles received a handwritten note from Lord Hastings, a friend of 50 years. "Be careful, Charles. Not everyone wearing the royal livery is serving your interests. There are enemies within." Charles's vision for his charitable foundations created another battleground. Having built the Prince's Trust and other organizations over decades, he intended to reshape royal philanthropy under a more focused umbrella. This threatened long-established patronage networks and the influence that came with them. During a meeting with charity executives, Charles was puzzled by their defensive posture until he realized they had been misinformed about his intentions. "Who told you I wanted to withdraw support?" he asked directly. The uncomfortable silence was eventually broken. "Your private office, sir. They said you were prioritizing environmental causes at the expense of others." It was a deliberate misrepresentation of the king's wishes. Financial tensions escalated when the annual sovereign grant review approached. The grant, which funds the monarch's official duties, became a point of contention between Buckingham Palace and the separate households of other working royals. "The Princess Royal's office has requested additional funding for overseas visits," noted the keeper of the Privy Purse, while the Kensington Palace establishment is seeking an increased communications budget. With resources finite and Charles's vision requiring reallocation of funds, budget meetings grew increasingly tense. Staff who had transitioned from Clarence House found themselves at odds with the Buckingham Palace Old Guard, creating an atmosphere one insider described as "civil war with better manners." The final straw came when Charles discovered a critical policy memo regarding Commonwealth youth initiatives had never reached him, despite being addressed to him personally. The document had been intercepted and buried in committee discussions. Charles's diplomatic initiatives created another friction point. His plans to host a climate summit at Buckingham Palace, alarmed Foreign Office officials, who feared it might conflict with government policy positions. During an emergency meeting at the palace, senior courtiers discussed how to manage the king's influence without his knowledge. One suggested, "His Majesty needs guidance on the constitutional limitations of his role." What they didn't realize was that Charles had spent 50 years studying precisely those limitations and knew exactly how far he could push them. Internal polling revealed public confusion about Charles's vision for the monarchy, with conflicting narratives emerging in media coverage. Constitutional experts began publicly debating the appropriate role of the modern monarch, with pointed references to Charles's activist past. While reviewing state papers, Charles discovered a document outlining plans to manage his public appearances without his input, effectively sidelining him from events where his environmental views might prove controversial. For a man who had waited 7 decades to become king, this final evidence of undermining from within would prove the turning point. The Sunday Times headline stunned the nation. Royal Household Civil War. King Charles faces unprecedented resistance. The front page exclusive detailed what the paper called a palace coup in slow motion, with multiple anonymous sources describing coordinated efforts to contain the new king's agenda. Senior figures within the royal household are actively working to moderate what they see as His Majesty's more radical instincts, claimed one source described only as a figure with intimate knowledge of palace operations. Another, identified as a former senior courtier still connected to royal circles, was quoted saying, "There's genuine concern that His Majesty's approach could inadvertently damage the institution. This isn't disloyalty, it's institutional self-preservation." The explosive article detailed specific examples of the king being kept in the dark about communication strategies, having access to information controlled, and even suggested that certain staff members were deliberately slow-walking reforms. Most damaging was the insinuation that other senior royals might be tacitly supportive of the resistance. "The household is not united in its vision for the monarchy's future," noted the article, with deliberate ambiguity about which royals might share such concerns. Charles, reading the article over breakfast at Highgrove, maintained his composure, but those present noted how his hand tightened around his teacup. His first instinct was to summon Sir Malcolm Barrett, his most senior aide, only to be informed that Sir Malcolm was unavailable due to a prior commitment, despite the obvious crisis. The absence spoke volumes. By midday, the palace issued a carefully worded statement. Buckingham Palace notes with concern certain mischaracterizations regarding His Majesty's working relationships. The king continues to enjoy the full support of the royal household in delivering his vision for a modern monarchy serving all communities of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth. The statement's measured tone belied the confrontation happening behind palace walls. Charles, returning unexpectedly to Buckingham Palace, requested an immediate meeting with his principal private secretary. "I want to know," the king said with dangerous calm once the doors closed, "exactly who has been speaking to the Sunday Times." The conversation that followed was described by one source as seismic, the first time Charles directly confronted the coordinated resistance to his leadership. That evening, several former royal household members appeared on television news programs, adding credibility to the reports of institutional resistance to change. "The palace operates like any large institution with entrenched interests," explained Lady Sarah Montgomery, who had served in the Queen's household for 2 decades. "Change is always resisted, but in this case, there appears to be an organized effort rather than just institutional inertia." The timing couldn't have been worse politically. Parliament was debating the next sovereign grant, with questions now being raised about governance within the royal household. Can the minister assure the House that taxpayer funds are being properly administered within a household reportedly in disarray? Asked one MP during Prime Minister's questions. That afternoon, Charles made a discovery that transformed his approach. While reviewing correspondence, he found evidence that confidential briefing papers about his environmental initiatives had been leaked to specifically undermine his position. Handwritten notes in the margin revealed the calculated nature of the betrayal. The court circular announced that the king had cancelled 3 days of scheduled appearances, citing administrative matters requiring attention. The diplomatic phrasing fooled no one. In their private apartments that evening, Camilla found Charles at his desk, surrounded by papers, making notes with methodical precision. "They think I don't understand the game being played," he said without looking up. 50 years as heir to the throne taught me more than they realize." Camilla placed a hand on his shoulder. "What will you do?" "Bring everything into the light," he replied, finishing his notes. "It's the one thing they're unprepared for." The next morning, the Privy Council was summoned for an extraordinary meeting, a rare move that signaled the seriousness of the situation. Simultaneously, royal watchers noted unusual activity at royal residences, with key staff members seen arriving at Buckingham Palace for unscheduled meetings. Something significant was clearly underway. The first public indication of Charles's strategy came unexpectedly. Despite cancelling official engagements, he made a surprise appearance at a sustainable farming conference, an organisation he had long supported as Prince of Wales. The move was widely interpreted as a show of strength, demonstrating he would not be diverted from his principles. More tellingly, during this appearance, he referenced overcoming obstacles to progress in a speech that many interpreted as having dual meaning. Behind the scenes, Charles implemented a strategic test of loyalty. Different versions of a minor policy proposal were distributed to various departments, each with subtle variations. The exercise quickly revealed which information channels could be trusted and which were compromised. The following day brought another surprise. Prince William joined his father for an unscheduled joint engagement, a clear visual statement of unity. Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace released identical statements, emphasizing shared vision and values across generations of royal leadership. Market research commissioned by the Palace Communications team revealed an unexpected public reaction to the Sunday Times revelations. 68% of respondents expressed support for Charles's modernization efforts, with particularly strong backing among younger demographics. As speculation reached fever pitch, Charles gathered his senior team. "I've identified the problem," he informed them with quiet authority. "Tomorrow, we begin implementing the solution." That evening, royal correspondents received notice of an organizational announcement to be made the following morning. The carefully neutral phrasing did little to disguise the significance of what was coming. The announcement, when it came, sent shockwaves through the establishment. Buckingham Palace today announces a comprehensive restructuring of the royal household to better serve His Majesty's vision for a modern, efficient, and environmentally responsible monarchy. The statement continued with bureaucratic language about streamlined reporting structures and alignment of operational priorities. But royal watchers immediately understood the earthquake beneath the measured words. Simultaneously, 7 senior royal household figures were summoned to individual meetings, their arrivals carefully timed to avoid contact with each other. The palace corridors hummed with tension as staff tried to interpret the unprecedented moves. Media speculation reached a crescendo, with the BBC's royal correspondent reporting what appears to be the most significant restructuring of the royal household in generations. Constitutional experts scrambled to contextualize the king's authority to reshape his establishment. While the monarch has absolute authority over appointments to the royal household, such comprehensive changes are without modern precedent, noted Dr. Eleanor Hardwick of King's College London. This represents a clear statement of King Charles III's determination to assert control over his reign. As the appointed hour approached for the most critical confrontation, Charles prepared himself in the study that had once been his mother's. On his desk lay the evidence he had methodically gathered, alongside the strategy he had carefully developed. "Sir," said the equerry at the door, "they're ready for you." Charles stood, straightened his tie, and prepared to face the moment that would define the early years of his reign. The king's private audience room at Buckingham Palace had witnessed centuries of history: declarations of war, abdication discussions, prime ministerial resignations. Now it would host another pivotal moment: a monarch confronting a rebellion within his own household. Outside, camera crews and royal correspondents maintained vigil, aware that something significant was unfolding, though uncertain of its precise nature. Palace press officers offered no comment beyond confirming an internal administrative review was underway. Charles entered the room alone, deliberately choosing not to surround himself with allies. Before him sat the 7 most senior figures in the royal household, together representing over 2 centuries of service to the crown. Their faces revealed varying degrees of apprehension, defiance, and calculation. The king placed a single folder on the table and remained standing, immediately establishing the power dynamic. For a moment, he said nothing, studying the faces before him. Then, rather than the harsh confrontation many expected, Charles did something unexpected. "Before we begin," he said quietly, "I want to thank each of you for your service to the crown. My mother valued institutional memory and tradition, as do I." The room shifted almost imperceptibly, wrong-footed by the gentle opening. "I understand that change creates uncertainty," Charles continued. "I understand that my vision for the monarchy may differ in approach, though not in ultimate goal, from what came before. What I cannot accept, however, is disloyalty." The word hung in the air like a judge's gavel. Throughout British history, monarchs facing internal challenges had few options, from Henry VIII's brutal treatment of perceived disloyalty to Queen Victoria's withdrawal from public life when opposed. Charles was forging a different path, one that acknowledged modern governance while honoring ancient authority. "This institution has survived for over 1,000 years by adapting while maintaining core principles," Charles continued, his voice gaining strength. "I had hoped for honest counsel, even disagreement. What I cannot abide is obstruction." He opened the folder, revealing evidence of the coordinated efforts to undermine his leadership: the intercepted memos, the leaked documents, the manipulated briefings. Each was meticulously annotated in his own handwriting. What followed surprised even those who thought they understood the king. Rather than demanding resignations or issuing ultimatums, Charles appealed to their shared commitment to the institution they all served. "We face unprecedented challenges: public scrutiny, questions of relevance, environmental crisis, societal division. We cannot address these divided, nor can we address them by simply maintaining the status quo." The king's emotional intelligence, often overshadowed by his intellectual interests, now demonstrated itself fully. He spoke to individual concerns, acknowledging valid critiques of his approach while firmly establishing his authority as monarch. Support emerged from unexpected quarters. Sir James Whitby, thought to be among the resistance, spoke up. "Your Majesty, while I have expressed concerns about pace, I have never questioned the direction. The Sunday Times article misrepresented many of our positions." Lady Victoria Hamilton, who had served 3 generations of royals, added, "Some of what you've identified, sir, represents genuine concern for the institution rather than opposition to your leadership, though the methods were clearly inappropriate." The conversation shifted from confrontation to problem-solving, though tension remained palpable when Charles addressed the most serious breaches of trust. The king invoked rarely discussed royal prerogatives regarding household governance. As constitutional monarch, his powers in matters of state were limited, but within his household, his authority remained nearly absolute, a fact established in case law since the 17th century. "I am not merely your employer," he reminded them. "I am your sovereign." When Lord Bartholomew, the most senior and previously the most resistant figure, attempted to defend the institutional perspective, Charles revealed his most damning evidence: documentation showing Bartholomew had deliberately misrepresented the king's wishes to government officials. "This ends today," Charles said with quiet finality. By mid-afternoon, 3 resignation statements had been prepared, each with carefully crafted language about pursuing other opportunities and the privilege of royal service. Behind the diplomatic phrasing lay the reality: those who could not adapt to the new reign would depart. Unlike his ancestors, Charles sought no vengeance, only clarity and alignment. By addressing core issues rather than personalities, he created space for reconciliation where possible, while making boundaries clear. After the meeting, described by one participant as the most extraordinary 5 hours of my palace career, Charles retreated to his study. Only Camilla witnessed the emotional toll the confrontation had taken. His public strength gave way to momentary vulnerability as he questioned whether he had struck the right balance between authority and understanding. "It had to be done," Camilla reassured him. "Your mother would have approved of your handling, if not the necessity." As evening approached, an unexpected message arrived: a handwritten note from Sir Martin Charteris, who had been Queen Elizabeth's most trusted private secretary. Now in his 90s, his intervention carried unique weight. "Your Majesty," the note began, "having heard accounts of today's events, I am compelled to share that Her late Majesty once confided her belief that you would face precisely such a challenge early in your reign. Charles will need to establish himself decisively," she told me. "The institution resists every new monarch. It is the first test they must pass." The note confirmed what Charles had suspected. His mother had anticipated this moment, though she had chosen not to warn him explicitly, understanding that how he handled it would define his kingship. In the days that followed, Charles implemented a series of changes that balanced necessary modernization with respect for tradition. The household restructuring preserved ceremonial roles while streamlining operational functions. Environmental considerations were integrated into royal operations, but with pragmatic timelines that acknowledged institutional constraints. Most significantly, he established new transparency protocols within the household, ensuring information flowed properly to the monarch while respecting the advisory role of senior officials. Public appearances by multiple royal family members, carefully coordinated across different households, demonstrated a united front. Images of Charles with the Princess Royal, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, and the Prince and Princess of Wales created a powerful visual narrative of continuity and strength. The final test came 3 weeks later, with preparations for a major state visit, the first to be fully planned and executed under the new household structure. The diplomatic complexities were considerable, involving sensitive negotiations with a key Commonwealth partner, alongside significant security concerns. As the royal household mobilized for this critical moment, a last pocket of resistance emerged from an unexpected quarter. The Lord Chamberlain's office, traditionally responsible for ceremonial arrangements, expressed grave concerns about proposed changes to the welcome ceremony. The objection, ostensibly about protocol but fundamentally about control, represented the final challenge to Charles's authority. How he responded would determine whether the changes he had implemented would endure. The state visit of Australia's Governor-General represented Charles's first major international diplomatic test since the household restructuring. For 3 days, the full machinery of monarchy would be on display. from ceremonial welcomes to state banquets, from diplomatic discussions to public appearances. The world's media descended on London, aware of the recent palace turbulence and eager to assess the new king's command of his role. Foreign diplomats watched with particular interest, knowing that this event would set the tone for Charles's international relationships. The preparations revealed the new dynamics within the royal household. Staff who had previously worked in separate silos now coordinated seamlessly, with clearer lines of authority and better information flow. The king's environmental priorities had been integrated thoughtfully. Electric state vehicles, sustainable menu choices, plastic-free protocols, without compromising the grandeur expected of a state occasion. "It's rather remarkable," observed the Australian ambassador during final preparations. "We were concerned given the recent reports, but this has been the most efficient royal event I've experienced in my diplomatic career." The last-minute objection from the Lord Chamberlain's office, challenging changes to the welcome ceremony that would incorporate Indigenous Australian recognition, represented the final test of Charles's leadership. Rather than overruling or accommodating the objection, the king requested something unprecedented: a direct presentation of both perspectives. In the newly established Royal Household Executive Committee, both the traditional protocol team and the King's Innovation Unit presented their positions. Charles listened carefully, asked probing questions, and then made a clear decision that respected tradition while embracing necessary change. "The ceremony will proceed with the Indigenous welcome," he ruled, "but with traditional elements preserved and contextualized. The monarchy must acknowledge both its history and the world as it exists today." The Lord Chamberlain, who had expected either capitulation or confrontation, found himself instead respectfully heard and partially accommodated. It was a masterclass in leadership that transformed a potential opponent into a cautious ally. As the state visit began, international media noted the flawless execution and the king's commanding presence. The BBC's diplomatic correspondent observed, "What we're witnessing is a monarch completely in control, both of the ceremonial aspects where Queen Elizabeth excelled and the substantive policy discussions where King Charles brings his own strengths." Even politicians who had privately questioned Charles's approach found themselves impressed. "He's navigated this transition with more skill than many gave him credit for," admitted one cabinet minister to a diplomatic colleague, unaware their conversation was overheard by a journalist. The climactic moment came during Charles's address at the state banquet, a speech that subtly but clearly articulated his vision for the monarchy without directly referencing the recent turmoil. "The crown serves as a bridge between past and future, between nations and peoples, between tradition and innovation," he told the assembled dignitaries. To serve as that bridge effectively requires both strong foundations in our shared history and a willingness to span new waters as they emerge. The speech, broadcast live and subsequently analyzed by constitutional experts, was recognized as Charles's definitive statement on his approach to monarchy. It acknowledged institutional continuity while unapologetically embracing necessary evolution. Most telling was the reaction within the palace itself. Staff who had once been skeptical now expressed quiet pride in their monarch's performance. Former critics found themselves nodding in agreement with his balanced approach. "He's won them over," observed a veteran royal correspondent, "not through concession, but through competence." The implementation of the slimmed-down monarchy began in earnest following this successful diplomatic test. Announcements regarding royal patronages, property usage, and operational changes were rolled out strategically, each careful to balance efficiency with the majesty expected of the institution. Public opinion polls reflected growing approval for Charles's approach, with support reaching its highest level since the coronation. Particularly notable was improved sentiment among younger demographics, traditionally the most skeptical of the monarchy's relevance. The final element requiring resolution was the relationship between the King and the Prince of Wales. While publicly supportive throughout the crisis, there remained unanswered questions about the alignment of their visions for the monarchy's future. Following the state visit, Charles invited William to Sandringham for a private weekend. No staff, no advisors, just father and son discussing the institution they would both eventually lead. What transpired in those conversations remains private, but the outcome became clear in the weeks that followed. At a major environmental conference the following month, Charles and William made a joint appearance that demonstrated their unified approach. Where previous engagements had sometimes suggested parallel but separate visions, this presentation showed clear continuity and coordination. What makes this monarchy unique, William said during his introduction of his father, is its ability to represent continuity while embracing change. No one understands that balance better than His Majesty. The warm embrace that followed, not just ceremonial but genuinely affectionate, spoke volumes to those watching. In private, the conversation had been more nuanced. William had expressed honest concerns about certain approaches while affirming his father's overall direction. Charles had acknowledged his son's perspectives, recognizing that William would eventually inherit not just the throne, but the consequences of decisions made now. "I don't expect you to be my echo," Charles had told him during their private discussions. "I expect you to be your own man, as I have been. But I do ask that we work as allies, not as separate courts." William's response, "I've always been in your corner, even when I've suggested different tactics," cemented an understanding that would prove critical to the monarchy's stability. The final piece fell into place with the publication of a new royal charter, subtly but significantly redefining the monarchy's operations for the modern era. The document, developed with input from constitutional experts, clarified roles and responsibilities while establishing new governance principles. Foreign royal houses, many facing similar challenges of relevance and modernization, expressed support for Charles's reforms. The King of Sweden, in a rare public comment on another monarchy, noted that King Charles has shown courage in addressing institutional challenges that many of us recognize. The last significant institutional opposition dissolved when the Honours Committee, traditionally among the most conservative royal entities, endorsed Charles's proposals for modernizing the honours system to better reflect contemporary British society. A monarch who had begun his reign amid whispers of being merely transitional had established himself as transformational. The royal mutiny that had threatened to derail his early reign had instead become the crucible in which his leadership was forged. As Charles signed the final implementation orders for the household restructuring, the equerry waiting to receive the documents noted something telling. The king used not the ornate royal pen provided for ceremonial occasions, but the same modest fountain pen he had carried for decades as Prince of Wales, a small but significant symbol of a man who remained true to his principles while adapting to his new role. 1 year later, the royal helicopter descended through Scottish mist toward Balmoral Castle. As in the previous September, rain lashed against the ancient estate, but the man who gazed out at the familiar landscape was not the same monarch who had faced crisis 12 months earlier. King Charles III had aged a year, certainly, but the change was more fundamental than mere time. There was a settled authority in his bearing, a quiet confidence that came not from the crown itself, but from having weathered his first major test as sovereign. The royal household that accompanied him bore little resemblance to the fractured institution of the previous year. Where once there had been competing power centers and information silos, now there existed a streamlined operation with clear reporting structures and aligned priorities. "Your Majesty," said the new private secretary as they walked from the helipad. "The Prime Minister sends his congratulations on the first anniversary of the household reforms. The efficiency savings have apparently impressed the Treasury." Charles permitted himself a small smile. The reforms had indeed produced measurable results. A 17% reduction in operational costs, a 32% decrease in the monarchy's carbon footprint, and significantly increased public access to royal properties, all while maintaining the ceremonial splendor expected of the institution. More telling than these statistics was the changed atmosphere within palace walls. Staff surveys revealed dramatically improved morale and clearer understanding of institutional purpose. The them and us mentality that had separated different royal households had given way to more collaborative approaches. "The king's greatest achievement," noted one senior palace official who had survived the restructuring, "was resolving the crisis without creating martyrs. Those who left did so with dignity, while those who remained felt valued rather than merely victorious." That evening, as Charles and Camilla enjoyed a quiet dinner in the castle's small dining room, the Queen Consort raised her glass. "To survival," she said with the directness that had always characterized their relationship. "To adaptation," Charles countered, touching his glass to hers. "Mother always said the monarchy survives by changing just enough, just in time." The conversation turned reflective as they discussed the lessons of the past year. "The hardest part wasn't confronting the resistance," Charles admitted. "It was recognizing which criticisms were valid despite being poorly delivered." Indeed, this discernment had proven crucial to his success. The reformed household incorporated legitimate concerns raised during the conflict about maintaining tradition, about constitutional boundaries, about managing transition. What had been rejected was not the substance of every criticism, but the methods of obstruction. The media assessment of Charles's first major crisis as monarch had evolved from initial sensationalism to more thoughtful analysis. The Sunday Times, which had broken the original royal mutiny story, published a first anniversary piece titled "How King Charles Reimagined Royal Leadership," noting that what initially appeared as institutional resistance has transformed into a case study in change management. Constitutional historian Dr. Margaret Harewood observed in a BBC documentary, "What we've witnessed is the most significant royal transition since Victoria's recalibration of the monarchy after the Georgian excesses. Charles III has established that the monarchy can be simultaneously traditional and forward-thinking, a distinction that may well define his reign." Perhaps most significant was Charles's increased public confidence. The man who had once been criticized for seeming hesitant in his new role now projected quiet authority. Public engagements revealed a monarch comfortable in his position, able to balance ceremonial requirements with authentic personal connection. "He stopped trying to be his mother," noted one long-serving royal protection officer, "and started being himself, which is exactly what the institution needed." The reformed royal household had also reshaped the monarchy's relationship with other British institutions. Government departments reported clearer communication channels with royal offices. Charitable organizations praised the more strategic approach to patronages. Even Parliament, traditionally wary of royal influence, acknowledged the more transparent engagement on matters with constitutional dimensions. As darkness fell over Balmoral, Charles stood at the same window where he had contemplated the brewing storm a year earlier. The physical view was identical, the Scottish Highlands fading into misty darkness, but his perspective had fundamentally changed. "We've weathered worse in our 1,000-year history," he murmured, echoing his mother's favorite reminder during difficult times. The historical context provided important perspective. Compared to previous royal crises, Edward VIII's abdication, the monarchical turbulence following Queen Victoria's withdrawal from public life, the challenges of the 1990s, this mutiny had been resolved with remarkable speed and minimal public damage. The household culture that emerged from the crisis represented Charles's most lasting achievement. New staff reported an environment where respectful disagreement was valued, but where ultimate decision-making authorities were clear. Transparency had replaced the whispered conversations of the previous era. What the king established, observed Lady Anne Weatherby, who had witnessed the first signs of trouble a year earlier, was that loyalty to the crown means honest counsel, not blind agreement or covert resistance. As Charles reviewed the next day's schedule, a public engagement highlighting sustainable rural economies, followed by meetings with local community leaders, he felt a satisfaction that transcended the immediate crisis resolution. The monarchy he was shaping would, he hoped, serve his son and grandson well when their time came. The institution that had initially resisted his vision was now implementing it, not through compulsion, but through conviction. The vision itself had evolved through the crucible of conflict, emerging more nuanced and effective than it might have been without challenge. Charles closed the curtains against the Scottish night, turning back to the warmly lit room that represented both the weight of history and the possibilities of the future. The monarchy that had weathered this storm would face others, certainly, but it would do so with foundations strengthened rather than weakened by this first test of a new reign. What would you have done in King Charles's position? When faced with institutional resistance, whether subtle or overt, the choices are rarely simple. Would you have confronted the situation head-on as Charles ultimately did, or taken a more gradual approach to change? Perhaps you might have compromised more of your vision to maintain harmony, or conversely, made even more dramatic changes to assert authority. The tension between tradition and modernization defines not just the monarchy, but many of our most enduring institutions. The British royal family represents this dilemma in its most visible form, an ancient institution operating in a rapidly evolving world. How much change is necessary for relevance, and how much continuity is essential for meaning? Charles's approach suggested a middle path, but reasonable people might argue for different balances. Consider too the constitutional implications. The monarchy operates within carefully defined boundaries, yet those boundaries have always contained grey areas where personal influence and formal powers overlap. Recent parliamentary discussions have questioned whether clearer codification of royal household operations might be beneficial, or whether such formalization would undermine the flexibility that has allowed the institution to evolve over centuries. In watching Charles navigate these treacherous waters, we might ask ourselves the most fundamental question of all. Did this crisis ultimately strengthen or weaken the monarchy's future? The institution survived, certainly, as it has survived far greater challenges throughout its millennium of existence. But survival alone is not the measure of institutional health. The true test will be whether this episode represented merely a transitional adjustment or the beginning of a more profound evolution in how monarchy functions in the 21st century. Perhaps that question can only be answered by the generations to come.